I'm a former judge of the family court, now practising back at the Brisbane Bar. I'm also a part-time Masters of International Relations student at the University of Queensland and a member of the Council of the Queensland chapter of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. The Queensland chapter is indeed very pleased to be involved and associated with this event, and grateful for being invited by Professor Charles Sanford to participate in today's event. I just want to commence firstly by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and paying my respects to their elders past, present and future. I also want to pay my respects to all of the eminent speakers that we've had so far today and that we are going to hear from this afternoon. Indeed, so far today, the discussion and presentations have been thought-provoking, if not a little scary, very interesting. It's just a shame that there are not a lot more people here participating in this discussion. Now, this afternoon, in this session, we're going to hear from Professor Charles Sanford. And Charles, as you know, has been the person principally responsible for drawing this event together. Charles has an eminent CV, the details of which you can all read with some time in the program. I particularly just want to point out his fellowships at Oxford and Harvard University, which in itself would be hard to top. I just asked Charles Sanford a few moments ago if he remembered where we first met back in the 90s, and he couldn't, and it's not in his CV, and I told him I'd remind him. In the early 90s, both of us served on the Queensland Committee of the Australian Republican movement in the lead up to the Republican Convention or the Constitutional Convention in Canberra and the unsuccessful referendum. Both of us, of course, served under the national leadership of Malcolm Turnbull, and as history shows, we were defeated by the leadership of John Howard and Tony Abbott. But as Bob Carr said earlier today, you never know what's over the horizon, Charles. So the Republican issue, I note, has recently gained a little bit of life again, although we may not see much of it in this term of federal government, but it might come back to life yet. So hopefully we might yet live to see a republic in this country. The second speaker that we'll have this afternoon is also of great eminence, Professor Ramesh Thakur. And I asked him a little bit about himself just before, particularly the description given in the CV of being a former UN Assistant Secretary. And the professor told me that he was a UN Assistant Secretary based principally in Tokyo, working in the academic university sector, and described himself colloquially as the scientist in charge, effectively, for the United Nations. Beg your pardon? Political scientist in charge for the United Nations. So we're indeed honoured and privileged to have these two people speaking to us this afternoon, and I'll start by calling on Professor Sanford to come and address you all.
It's a real pleasure to speak today. There are the three anniversaries we're talking about, which is very important. The Sanford family has its own 80th anniversary. In February 1942, this rising young concert cellist, Horry Sanford, volunteered to be a coast watcher. He was told, no, I don't think that suits you, and he was told to report to Australian Naval Intelligence, which became part of MacArthur's GHQ for the Southwest Pacific. He was a trusted intelligence analyst and actually had access to all the secrets of the war apart from the bomb, which the Americans had wisely not yet told him about. But it was interesting that there was a group of very, very young people, most of them younger than the young UNAA people here, including people like Caspar Weinberger and Zelman Cowen. All of them were lieutenants and sub-lieutenants at the beginning and through most of the time. But the interesting thing is that they, and I heard stories from both my father and from Zelman, that they were not afraid to speak up. And in fact, the thing is, unlike some later intelligence analysts in America and Australia, they would, if the brass wanted a particular assessment, they actually would push back very hard because, of course, at that stage, America and Australia couldn't afford to lose wars. They had to do the right thing, and I think that it's something that standing up to the brass and saying how it is really important in any relationship. It's important in military intelligence, absolutely critical. The path of intelligence analysts saying what the leaders want leads you to the Six-Day War. NASA was still being told on day 5 of the Six-Day War that they were winning, and that doesn't help very much. And in fact, my own view, I think that Australia and America should be friends. They should be allied. But one of the most important things a friend can do is, if the other friend is actually making a huge mistake, you actually perform the greatest service in a friendship. Instead of cheerleading folly, you say, "I'm sorry, I really think that's folly." You say it quietly, you say it strongly, and you won't go along with it if it's a mistake. And I think the thing is that these young lieutenants, with all the secrets of the war at their fingertips, and they push back. So how much more should our senior politicians and particularly military analysts do the same thing? But I don't speak here as the long lost son of an intelligence analyst. By the way, one of the important points of this story is that had my father been accepted for service as a coast watcher, I probably wouldn't be here and delivering this speech. Now, I hope I don't, by the end of this, generate a response that you might actually wish that was the case. I'm here to talk as a lawyer about the important contributions the US has made to the development of the international rule of law and the contribution that Australia has been. Generally America leading, but always Australia taking a significant part. I'll list them and I'll go through them individually, from the Kellogg-Briand Pact through to the UN General Assembly Global Summit, and talk about the international rule of law. Firstly, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg, you guessed, is an American, Briand was a Frenchman, and they actually wrote and promoted a treaty which was signed by the US and the French, of course, and by 13 others, including Australia. They agreed to condemn the recourse to war for the solution of international controversies and renounced it as an instrument of national policy. And they agreed to settle all disputes or conflicts of whatever nature or of whatever origin they may be, which may arise among them, shall never be sought except by specific means. This was carried on through in the UN Charter, which of course was something that FDR was absolutely committed to and is prepared to make some very considerable sacrifices, including the rights of certain Eastern European countries, in order to get a United Nations. And of course, the thing is that Doc Evatt and others were a very significant part of that, and Australia actually chaired the very first meeting of the United Nations Security Council in London. So that it's been a critical part. And the UN Charter pulled in these elements. The Article 2.3, again, settling international disputes by peaceful means, refrain from the use or threat of force, and also providing some consequences, some enforcement mechanisms. Firstly, of course, hopefully by the United Nations Security Council, but recognising that they might not act, the inherent right of individual and collective self-defence. This was built into ANZUS and NATO. Article 1 is virtually identical for the two alliances, I'm quoting from the ANZUS one. As you can see, Article 1 is the parties undertake as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations to settle any international disputes in which they may be involved by peaceful means, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purpose of the United Nations. This is strong stuff. And Australia was very great supporter of the United States in the great support of the United States in the Charter and in ANZUS. And also the thing is that there was the Nuremberg and Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals. Australia provided the William Webb to preside over the Tokyo trial, but it was Robert Jackson who made the most critical rule of law point, as you can read there. Let me make it clear that while this law is first applied against German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve any useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit now in judgment. Few statements could be more appropriate for the international rule of law. Lest anyone think that the international rule of law is some recent pinko invention of democratic appointees like Jackson, which no self-respecting Republican would support, they should consider the following quote from President Eisenhower. I must say the thing is that when RA first picked this up, I went home and I teased my children absolutely mercilessly. They are absolutely committed to the UN and so forth, and guessing who actually said this. And even after numerous hints, they didn't get it. It's a party trick I play with good friends and relations, because they might otherwise be rather annoyed by it. But it's interesting to hear that Eisenhower said in 1959, on a visit to India, one of the Quads, what became one of the Quads, the time has come for mankind to make the rule of law in international affairs as normal as it is now in domestic affairs. Of course, the structure of such law must be patiently built stone by stone, costs a lot of hard work, emphasising the role of universities. Plainly, one foundation stone is the International Court of Justice and the obligatory jurisdiction of that court. And he said, one final thought on the rule of law between nations. We will all have to remind ourselves that under this system of law, one will sometimes lose as well as win. But if an international controversy leads to armed conflict, everybody loses. I quote the latter not just because it's a powerful plea for the international rule of law and the ICJ, but because it's coming from what might be seen an unlikely source, a Republican US general and president. And it shows that we may hope that the support for the rule of law may be much broader than it sometimes appears. And of course, that last comment is something we should recognise, because he had been in charge of UN forces, as they were appropriately called after January the 2nd, 1942, United Nations forces in Europe, and he had seen quite enough killing to have that attitude. Better to go to court and lose than to go to war and everybody loses. The United States had accepted compulsory jurisdiction at the very beginning, and in fact this is a leadership Australia did not follow until 1975. These sentiments were reflected in the UN Global Summit in 2005, unanimously adopted by the leaders in the largest collection to date. They reaffirmed their commitment to the purpose of the Charter and international law, and to an international order based on the rule of law and international law. Recognised the important role of the International Court of Justice and called upon states to consider accepting the jurisdiction of the court. Disappointed that they used the word consider, but at least they emphasised that. Now, of course, some people might think this is slightly unreal, because, of course, unfortunately, the United States and their junior partner, Australia, have not always followed those very, very high-minded ideals. In fact, I would say, look, I agree entirely with all those sentiments, and indeed the international rule of law is such a good idea that I think we should actually practice it. Unfortunately, we don't always. Jackson and Eisenhower would be deeply disappointed and rolling in their respective graves. From time to time, particularly US presidents may think that the international rule of law is an unacceptable constraint on their power, or as the Japanese president of the ICJ once put it, there is a big temptation and many people give in to the temptation. So unfortunately, despite the real leadership and pressing and the importance of the international rule of law, the rules-based order, after 40 years of accepting compulsory jurisdiction, Reagan mined the Nicaraguan harbours. Nicaragua was sued. As Ike said, warned and was prepared to accept, sometimes you lose. This was one of those times. Reagan said the court case was political and withdrew compulsory recognition of the compulsory jurisdiction, which is an early indication of a fundamental mistake about the separation of powers and the rule of law, to see the court case in front of the least stackable court in the whole world, to see that as some fundamental problem. Then, of course, there's Bush the Elder. I switch between, sometimes I call them Bush the Elder and Bush the Younger to reflect Pitt the Elder and Pitt the Younger. Sometimes I just call George W. Bush George III of America. One of the most remarkable things, of course, is that after George Washington, there was not another George as an American president until H.W. Bush. And then, of course, we had George III of America, who actually displayed a number of characteristics that were unfortunate and actually reflect. I won't go into the comparisons between George III of America and George III of the UK. Anyway, George Bush the Elder went to considerable pains to secure UN authorisation and a wide coalition. And that's despite the fact that the right of collective self-defence could have been used. But no, he went to the UNSC and he got those strengths. Now, I know that the relative position powers of the permanent members is different then than now, but he was set an example of what you actually do. Clinton, Blair, Bush and Howard paraded lawyers when it came to Kosovo and when it came to Iraq. The various leaders paraded lawyers who claimed the action was legal. Of course, I've pointed out for a long time that there's a temptation to seek and a temptation to give the advice the client wants. There are two very important constraints on them. One of them is legal ethics, and the other is much more powerfully that judges may rule differently. And if you give your client the advice they want and they go down howling in court, then they won't thank you, any more than a friend whose folly has been cheered on, only to discover the disasters it leads them to. But of course, Australia decided to change its recognition of compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. They did this in March 2002, when in March 2002 they changed the recognition of the International Court of Justice compulsory jurisdiction. Up until then, anybody could sue Australia. It's the same thing as in America for its 40 years. Anybody who signed up to compulsory jurisdiction could sue you right away. And there are a number of countries which say, no, anybody can sue us, but they've got to have signed up to the compulsory jurisdiction for the International Court of Justice for 12 months, which means that you can attack them without any court case within any time in that 12 months. Now, the fact that this was almost to the day a year before the Iraq invasion of Iraq, I put no significance on whatsoever. What I do put significance on is that 2 weeks earlier, the British Cabinet had been given unequivocal legal advice that the contemplated war would be illegal. And the thing is that Australia actually, as a partner, had a number of choices at this point. They could politely refuse to take part. They might, like a friend, say this is wrong, this is folly, and it's illegal. Or they could, if they left their compulsory recognition, their recognition of compulsory jurisdiction as it was, they would almost certainly have received interim orders telling them to stop the invasion long before the American troops reached Baghdad, which obviously would not be a very helpful thing for an ally to do. So what Australia did was to change its recognition of the ICJ so that, and I can't prove the motivation, but anybody at the time would have known that it had only taken a couple of weeks before the Kosovo case was run, despite the fact that at the time, at the start, Yugoslavia was not actually even recognised by the UN. So that Australia made that choice. A vast majority of international lawyers said it was illegal. No opinion was sought from the Solicitor General, the most senior international lawyer in government. I note two things. Firstly, that because of this problem in international law that you can't always have a compulsory jurisdiction, and because so often international law is a matter of choice as to whether you go to court or not, opinions of international law professors is actually a source of international law. It's obviously overridden by decisions of competent courts, especially the ICJ. But without a decision by the ICJ, those opinions of international law professors count and will determine the issue until a court decides otherwise. And on this basis, given the vast majority of international lawyers considered it to be very, very clearly illegal, then in that case the war is illegal. Now, I think the Australian government thought this is a very clever thing to do. We will make sure that no judge can hear the case, therefore we're innocent. It actually works the other way around, because the thing is that there is this other source of international law, obviously based upon precedents and so forth. The other thing is that there was a breach of the ANZUS Treaty, Article 1, that I showed you just a few minutes ago. And everybody says that ANZUS is the most important treaty we have, and I agree. But why would we breach the first article of the most fundamental and most important, treaty we have? Now, I don't, and why have we so cavalierly breached it in such a fundamental way? I do not propose that we sue the United States for breaching the treaty at the same time as we did. In any case, the thing is that they've withdrawn their recognition of compulsory jurisdiction. Interesting enough, New Zealand could, because New Zealand is a signatory to the ANZUS Treaty. Despite the fact it's, quote, been suspended, there's no actual legal basis for that. It's just that both NZ and US decide to go their separate ways on nuclear-armed and nuclear-powered ships. But actually, if New Zealand did sue us in the International Court of Justice, they accept the compulsory jurisdiction and have done it for years. So there's the limitation in 2002 from the Australian recognition, change the recognition of the ICJ. We could, they could actually sue us, and to some extent it would be a great favour. If the suit was rejected, then Howard and Bush, who are almost universally considered to have breached international law in a very serious way, they'd be cleared. We need not worry that we'd breached our most important treaty, and Howard was not misleading the House in saying that we had ample legal authority for the action we were taking. If, of course, New Zealand's suit succeeded, it would provide some significant guidance for the future conduct of our international affairs. And would be, I'm sure that there'd be some anger. But on the other hand, the thing is that so many people, including the last Republican president, reckoned that it was a very bad idea. Then in that case, this might be useful. I could also go and talk about Iran, and they actually successfully sued the United States. Because they had in the ICJ, because there was a treaty left over from the days of the Shah, and like a lot of these treaties, there are interpretation provisions. The other one that I might particularly emphasise, of course, given the fun and games in Ukraine, is the case of Ukraine v Russia in the International Court of Justice. Once again, the court was assembled extremely quickly. and reached a decision for interim measures. The interesting thing about this is that the lawyers for Ukraine were very creative and effectively creative. The lawyers for Ukraine said, well, Russia is saying that we are committing a genocide. We are both... Sorry, 1 minute. Okay. We are both signatories to the Genocide Convention, and that, like many conventions, it has a provision within it that disputes over the interpretation of the treaty can be taken to the ICJ. So they said, well, actually, we disagree with it. We don't think a genocide's going on, so we want a determination by the ICJ that this is not genocide. And they went ahead and did it because actually Russia had not made a reservation in the Genocide Convention that they could only be sued in the ICJ if they agreed to it. And guess which country has made that reservation? This really important country, which has actually led discussion and debate and institutions of international law, is actually you can't accuse you can't take the US to court when allegedly committing genocide unless they agree. I actually discovered this back in times when I was researching the legality of the Kosovo War. Anyway, in summing up, there has been wonderful support for the international rule of law, rules-based order, by the United States and Australia. The United States has led more often. Australia has taken a very important part. We need to recommit to that, to both the improvement of our treaties. I won't go to the details. We've got a whole list of them. I've had an appendix for quite a few articles on the things we can do to improve the international rule of law. We need to do it. It's something that we hope that a current or future American administration will see as the right thing to do and in its own interests as well as in ours. So thank you very much. I speak in disappointment, but also in hope.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to the organisers for inviting me. It's been good to see so many old friends after the strange years of separation we've had. Having lived in Japan for some years, I begin with an apology. I've still got some phlegm in my system from a COVID infection some weeks ago, so if I break into coughing fit, please excuse me. Between power and principles, what role for the UN? If international consensus exists, the United Nations can provide the most authoritative forum for translating that consensus into norms, laws, treaties, policies, and operations for governing the global commons. In the foreseeable future, there simply is no substitute for the UN's institutional and political legitimacy. No other forum could leverage that process more efficiently or effectively. That said, the caveat is not a trivial if. Now, while this claim is true for the world as a whole, and therefore for a universal collective security system, it's inadequate for groups of countries that share common values, needs, and interests that are better served by collective defense arrangements and alliances. The first is all-inclusive. The second is highly selective and necessarily excludes identifiable adversaries, potential enemies, and other unlike-minded countries. The UN is indispensable for setting international standards and norms to regulate interstate behavior, but sadly deficient and subservient to the rich and powerful in monitoring and enforcing the rules of behavior. This makes it imperative for responsible governments to combine normative approaches at the global level with collaborative arrangements with like-minded and like-value countries through national policies to ensure the security and promote the welfare of their peoples. You'll recall that in the Melian dialogue, Thucydides recounts the stern admonition from Athens to Milos that questions of right and justice apply only to relations among equals in power. For the others, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. A matching Russian proverb holds that rules are for servants, not masters. But there's also the African proverb that, quote, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, unquote. My three-part talk will try to find a way through this maze of threads of ancient wisdom and contemporary global politics. I first describe international politics as a struggle not for power, but for normative ascendancy. I then examine the implications of this for Australia's alliances, before concluding with the place of the United Nations in a multidimensional foreign policy for Australia. It's not just the balance of power that provides order and stability and keeps anarchy at bay, but also a common set of values and international practices appropriate to them. And so I paraphrase the familiar mantra of realism thus: international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for normative ascendancy, the establishment and maintenance of the dominant normative architecture of international order, created and maintained by the interplay of power, principles, and ideas for the common good. In the era of unchallengeable primacy, the US deployed military firepower to punish alleged breaches of global norms by others, while exempting itself from the Gulliver-like constraints of global norms. There's a saying attributed to Mark Twain that God created war so Americans could learn geography. As former Congresswoman and presidential contender Tulsi Gabbard put it in a TV interview on 8th March this year, US, quote, leaders have this FU attitude, unquote. That double standard is less sustainable the more that US primacy wanes. Dangers lie ahead for Australia should China mimic past US unilateralism. Major powers can afford to be closer to the power end of the spectrum. Small states and middle powers have a greater interest in creating a rules-based order as a brake on unilateral military adventurism, albeit one that is backed by the military power of allies if it comes under threat. But there is also a risk entailed in this. By expanding ever closer to Russia's borders and ignoring repeated warnings of red lines, NATO managed to provoke, but not to deter, Putin. Then, in the resulting war, military assistance to Ukraine has helped to prolong, but neither to end nor to win the war. Meanwhile, sanctions have caused more economic and political problems in home country than in Russia. That's not a comforting three-part conclusion to draw. The quality of US political leadership in terms of vision, strategy, competence, judgment of the last and the current US president appears to be seriously deficient. Which begs the question, how wise are we to bet the house on a resurrected alliance of the Anglosphere? In this light, let me suggest there are four alternative framings of what's happening in Ukraine. And we've had one and two, mostly in our media, but there's also three and four. One, a great battle between democracy and autocracy, liberty and repression. Alternatively, two, a clash between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force, in which Russia violated fundamental or foundational global norms on state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and use of force. The first two frames together, in combination with the global dominance of Western media, explain why Westerners conflate their local consensus into a global consensus that simply doesn't exist. most of the non-Western world views the Ukraine conflict within the third frame of an ongoing recalibration of the Cold War, post-Cold War European balance of power. Fourth, contestations over Russia's place in Europe. In this final frame, the problem is that NATO failed to expand far enough eastwards to incorporate Russia within European security, economic, and political orders. Third, national foreign policy. Foreign policy is not about virtue signaling morality, but acting in the best interests of citizens. No country's policy is based solely on realism or idealism. Every country acts on a combination of geopolitical and economic calculations and core values and principles. No country's policy is consistent and coherent, so none is immune from elements of hypocrisy and double standards of the sort that Charles listed in his presentation. Many Western commentators were quick to condemn India's balancing act in juggling its interests and values in relation with Russia, Ukraine, and the West. Foreign Minister Jaishankar pointedly remarked on 11th April in Washington that since sanctions were imposed by NATO on Russia, India's oil imports over 1 month from Russia were probably less than European energy imports in just one afternoon. On 22nd April, the Telegraph UK reported that after the EU imposed an arms embargo on Russia in retaliation for the annexation of Crimea in 2014, France and Germany had sold 273 million euros worth of arms to Russia that was likely being used in the current war in Ukraine. Shiv Shankar Menon, former National Security Advisor in India, wrote in Foreign Affairs that the Ukraine war will transform Europe's geopolitical landscape, but is not a transcendental conflict between autocracies and democracies, will not reshape the global order, and has only limited relevance for the Indo-Pacific. In case you have forgotten, let me remind you, the world's most populous democracy by far is India, not the United States. Much like we do not have to choose between our history and geography, we don't confront a binary choice between nationalism and globalism, between power and principles. Rather, these tensions will continue to be a marked feature of our foreign policy, and the attempt to resolve the tension and reconcile the competing imperatives will depend on the precise circumstances, contingencies, Prime Minister, and government in power. After the Second World War, like others, Australia opted for both collective defense at the realist power end of the spectrum and collective security at the normative end. The two can complement, but rarely have they converged, and sometimes they clashed, as in Iraq in 2003. The ANZUS Treaty, and alongside it, a series of additional agreements, understandings, and practices consolidated the alliance under US leadership and its nuclear umbrella. Already cross-linked to NATO via the US as the linchpin of both security alliances, and through historical ties to the UK, the creation of AUKUS poses no major conceptual challenge and is the three countries' common answer to the growing military footprint of and strategic rivalry with China, alongside the shrinking economic and military weight of the United States. This is different from assessing its strategic merits and non-proliferation implications. That's a separate question. By contrast, the Quad had entirely benign origins in the Indian Ocean tsunami of December 2004, when the four most capable disaster relief navies operating in the Indian Ocean were those of Australia, India, Japan, and the US. As bilateral relations strengthened between India, the US, and its two Pacific allies, the Indo-Pacific construct, whose godfather was the late Shinzo Abe, helped to integrate India into the maritime strategic framework. The fortuitous circumstance of the four being well-established democracies allowed them to position the grouping as a champion of a free and open Indo-Pacific, governed by global rules rather than as an anti-China coalition. The Quad partners have a number of adjoining bilateral and even trilateral military arrangements and practices, but non-ally India's deeply internalized legacy of strategic autonomy is a real brake on the Quad's potential as a security alliance with military teeth. In any case, for Australia, India, and Japan, the single most important bilateral relationship is with the US, and the second with China. While for the US and the world, the most critical relationship in the region is US-China relations. Unfortunately, Australia's close identification with the US often puts it out of step with its region. In one of the most important and interesting, yet curiously neglected studies of elite perceptions published by Chatham House, in contrast to Europeans who emphasized America's historical moral leadership, the US is viewed by many Asian elites as hypocritical, overbearing, arrogant, and disinterested in others' interests, aggressively pushing its own policy priorities instead. This was in 2014, during the Obama presidency. I wonder what the sentiment was under Trump. And I recall whoever from the floor made the point earlier, of course, that our own most recent census maps the changing demographic profile of Australia, and that is yet to be reflected in public discussion, let alone foreign policy priorities being rejigged. But the basic point is that the age of the West disrespecting the rest's role, relevance, and voice is passing. A much-needed global rebalancing, geopolitical, economic, even moral, is in train, with Westerners having lost the capacity to set standards and rules of behavior for the whole world. So finally, coming to the UN. In the UN system, the power end of the spectrum is best represented by the Security Council, dominated by the veto-wielding P5 as the geopolitical center of gravity, while the General Assembly functions as the normative center of gravity. The various international legal, criminal justice, and other tribunals can be considered to be General Assembly satellites for this purpose. I give you my 6 axioms of power politics. 1, great powers rise and fall on the tide of history. 2, no power remains great forever. 3, no great power retreats forever. 4, there's no way to reliably judge in real time if a great power has begun its descent into permanent decline or is merely in temporary retreat. 5, geopolitical fault lines during periods of power transition are fraught with grave risks of war. And 6, the fate of lesser powers caught in the crossfire is determined as much by the outcome of great power contests as by their own efforts. And this is why it's in the interests of the majority of states who are not great powers to deepen and consolidate the normative architecture that can act as some check on great power predations, to endure as a robust and resilient set of principles, institutional arrangements, and state practices. This must be universally and not selectively implemented. Unfortunately, Australia sometimes confuses the justifiable tribalism of its alliance politics at the power end of the spectrum with the indispensable prerequisite of impartiality at the normative end. We cannot commit an act of aggression against Iraq in 2003 and then condemn Russia for invading Ukraine in 2022, or demand accountability for the downing of Flight MH17 in Ukraine in 2014, but not for the US shooting down Iran Air Flight IR-655 in 1988. the ossified Security Council remains trapped in the power equations of 1945, and even that imperfectly, and is therefore out of sync even with its core defining logic. Russia is not the only P5 member to have contributed to the growth of the widespread perception that powerful countries can break the rules of the Charter regime with impunity. We seem to be in an era of profound challenge to the liberal international order put in place after 1945 under US leadership. The existing governance institutions seem no longer fit for purpose in confronting current unforeseeable threats. Global problems require multilateral solutions, but the emerging multipolarity seems inclined more to confrontation than cooperation. Irvag is said to have remarked that the interesting thing about Richard Wagner's music is that it ain't as bad as it sounds. The same might be said of the United Nations. The causes of and solutions to most major public policy challenges are international, but the authority for addressing them is vested in states. In David Kennedy's words, national governments retain the authority to disable international policy making, but not the capacity to resolve problems on their own. And increasingly, they seem to lack the leadership and vision as well. Yet the United Nations remains the focus of the hopes and aspirations for a future where men and women live at peace with themselves and in harmony with nature. Based on human solidarity and transcending national perspectives, the United Nations provides and manages the framework for bringing together the world's leaders to tackle the pressing problems of the day for the survival, development, and welfare of all human beings everywhere. Like states, the United Nations too has to strike a balance between realism and idealism. It remains our one and best hope for unity in diversity in a world in which global problems do require multilateral solutions. It is the embodiment of the international community and the custodian of world conscience. It's an idea, a symbol of an imagined and constructed community of strangers. It exists to bring about a world where fear is changed to hope, want gives way to dignity, and apprehensions are turned into aspirations. Can we really afford to give up on that vision? Thank you.
It was terrific to hear that optimistic message of hope in respect of the United Nations, especially after just having heard only a week or so ago our former Prime Minister reported to have given an address where he certainly was expressing a lack of faith in the United Nations. We've got plenty of time now, so there's lots of questions that can be asked, but I just wanted to start by asking one, if I could, before I open the floor to others. And I had this conversation with Bob Carr during the lunch break. So the question is really for either of the two speakers we've just had, or any of the speakers that we've had today, but it probably brings into play some of the issues raised in the talks we've just had about the rule of law, but also questions that were raised this morning. But I've become particularly concerned personally about, or with, Australia's apparent determination under the previous government and apparently under this current federal government to maintain military presence in the South China Sea and to have our aircraft and ships exercise what they call rights of passage or freedom of navigation rights. And I became even more concerned recently when there were reports that a Chinese fighter jet had engaged one of our aircraft in in that area and had fired flares at it and then dropped what they call chaff that got sucked into the engine. It seemed to me that that sort of thing puts lives of Australian surface personnel at very serious risk at the moment, and makes me think about how far China might go in trying to put a wedge between Australia and America, test Australia's resolve, see what we might do in response if something more serious is done to one of our aircraft or ships, or even to test America's response if something more serious is done to one of our ships or aircraft. Is it really that important for maintaining the rule of law for us to be, pressing those sorts of issues in the South China Sea?
I'm sure Ramesh has got a lot to say on this. I just say that this is really important. Actually, it's one of the parts of the article I'm writing, that this speech was a part of it, that there's a particular problem for allies because there's a taboo for nuclear powers. It's been mentioned a couple of times already. Taboo for the nuclear powers to actually attack the territory or the armed forces of another nuclear power. And I was just thinking this thing that this is quite important, that if in fact there's an Australian ship, an American ship, or an Australian plane or an American plane, here's the deal, that the taboo means that they're not going to shoot at the American plane. But on the other hand, the thing is that if they do shoot at the Australian plane, I'm sure that what they did was calibrated not to bring the plane down, but to sort of demonstrate we can do things. But say if they did shoot down an Australian plane flying next to an American plane, the actual taboo is that the American plane doesn't shoot back. Because there's a taboo on actually finding, and of course in some cases this taboo is actually explicitly stated, as in Ukraine, when America says, we will not use our forces directly against the Russians. And I understand that, but of course it means it gives them, it's almost like I'm a Russian, I've got a special protective vest on. No, the nuclear power is going to shoot at me. But I can shoot if I shoot at them. So I think that there's actually a real problem. And because of this different dynamics, there's different calculus, because one's a nuclear power and we're not, is a very good reason for us not to do it. Now, of course, we don't say they're freedom of navigation patrols, but clearly the thing is this is much riskier for Australia than it is for China. And if China wants to demonstrate, it will demonstrate by shooting us down, or the first bomb will drop on Australia rather than in the United States. So this is just part of the calculus. It doesn't mean we don't have an alliance, but we're very careful. And of course we say to the Americans, look, I'm sorry, we're at much more risk than you are. You've got a lot of planes, we've got a small number of planes. Why don't you do it, and at less risk to yourself? So that's my view on that. The other thing I want to say is that when it comes to, there's a lot to be said for strategic ambiguity in what you're going to do. Rather than saying we will never shoot at a Russian in this war, you actually have legal clarity. This is what you're allowed to do, and we're not going to do it, but we could if we wanted to. And strategic ambiguity. At the moment, we seem to have legal ambiguity and strategic clarity, and I think that that's a major problem that we need to deal with in these kinds of conflicts or semi-conflicts or potential conflicts between nuclear and non-nuclear powered. It's always more dangerous to be the wingman for the nuclear-powered jet.
I think rather than answer your question directly, I'm going to offer a series of comments on a number of sessions in the morning, which fits into that. And that is on the theme of China-US relations and what it means for us in Australia. And the reason I do that is I find it interesting that very, very few Western commentators seem to get the balance right in trying to assess China and interpret China. They either go in one direction, too much appeasement, or in the other direction, too much confrontation. Now remember I said power transitions are always fraught with the danger of war. You have Harvard University's Graham Allison with his so-called Thucydides trap, where he studied power transitions over 500 years, 16 of them, 12 of the 16 ended up in violent war between the contestants. So that you have to remember that. Now, against that backdrop, remember that China, as a maritime continental power, has no tradition, historical, literary, philosophical, of operating as a major power in a system of great powers. The Europeans do, China doesn't. Its tradition is that of the Middle Kingdom, and tributaries go and kowtow to the Middle Kingdom. But at the same time, and I think this is something that Bob Carr was alluding to, or said it explicitly, the US has no tradition of acting, of relationship with a peer power. The Soviet Union was always one-dimensional. Military superpower, other respects, not a major power. For the first time, we have China as a comprehensive national power. The fact that more countries have a higher trade with China than do with the United States means that this whole notion of sanctions will have completely different effects if ever imposed on China, for example. And not having the tradition, the Americans go back to this DLP idea, dominance, leadership, primacy, as opposed to having to work out how we are going to operate in a shared strategic space, particularly in China's front yard, backyard, whatever you want to call it. Now, China also, we tend to forget, is returning the pendulum to the historical norm. China, as a weak country and humiliated country, was the great historical aberration. So we are coming back, resetting to the norm in the Pacific with China as a great power, not the other way around. And China as a rising hegemon for the region, potentially for the world, leaves us very uncomfortable. For the first time in several hundred years, a non-English speaking, non-liberal democratic, non-capitalist country as the hegemon, is not a comforting position intellectually and emotionally for most Westerners. To which my very brutal and blunt response is, get used to it. You don't have much choice. And given our geographical location, that has significant major implications for us, which we need to address and talk through, and we are not doing so. And we just had, a couple of weeks ago, this year's annual Hiroshima Roundtable, which discusses nuclear issues. And one of the things we discussed there was whether Ukraine disproves the claims that we've been making for years about the lack of utility of nuclear weapons. I don't think it does. So there's a lot that was said on that earlier before lunch that I disagree with profoundly, but that's a different debate. I won't go into that. But one of the things we did discuss was, well, two things. There are 9 countries with nuclear weapons today. Of the 9 countries, on this narrow issue, the leader who has to date demonstrated the greatest international responsibility is Xi Jinping of China. Others have demonstrated in their rhetoric and some of their actions various degrees of irresponsibility. And in the case of Putin, the statements he's made about Ukraine, in the context of Ukraine, I think is criminal irresponsibility. But China has been very responsible on that. And of the 9 countries, only 2 have what we call a no first use policy, and that's China and India. So one of the things that we discussed at the Hiroshima Roundtable and recommended in a public statement was, why do the United States and China not explore a bilateral no first use understanding, at the very least, or possibly even an agreement between them, including and particularly in the context of Taiwan. So take the nuclear issue out of any potential threats and risks that might arise. And it's these sorts of creative diplomatic initiatives that I think would be very much in our national interest as Australians. And we talked about, well, will they come and punish us? Will they assume that you have to be with us? The only question is how substantial the contribution will be. The closest country to us in this context is Canada. And I happen to have Canadian as well as Australian nationality. There's a Canadian scholar, Dennis Stairs, who wrote a very good book in the context of the Korean War called The Diplomacy of Constraint. But the argument was, you are a good, loyal ally, fine. But occasionally you need to speak out, preferably privately in confidential briefings to your major ally, but if need be, even publicly. Why? Because on any major contested issue, there are different competing strands of view within the US system, arguing for primacy in setting policy. And if you, as a loyal ally with a tradition of loyalty in most issues, speak out publicly, you help to shape that internal domestic debate. And that's where your greatest influence is likely to lie. Not in efforts to shame or embarrass your ally, but to nudge them towards policies that you think are slightly saner than what might otherwise be. So you constrain the policy-making environment, or you attempt to influence that. And that's something I think we can do, and we should do. And the notion that if we disagree once, it will have consequences that are damaging forever is just historically simply not borne out. Look how they denigrated France in 2003. How long did it take to repair that relationship? The Canadians with various things. Canada was not in Vietnam. Canada was not in Iraq. So it is possible to disagree once in a while, and it is important to do that. And in this case, we are in this region. That's right. The United States, I think it was a Malcolm Fraser line, the United States, if it loses, can go back. We are still here. That reality should, I think, be our number one priority. We are in this region to stay. How can we invest in long-term security? One final comment that I can't resist, the question about the diplomacy and defense. I agree that DFAT has been badly neglected and needs to be revitalized, but in my experience, as often, if not more, it's the generals who know the reality of war who are much more cautious about going to war compared to diplomats who tend to be very, very aggressive.
Hi, my name's Isabel. I am a representative for UNAA. Professor Ramos actually pretty much answered the question I was going to ask. I wanted to ask more of a hypothetical scope of question, more looking at going into the future, what can the international community actually do to better equip themselves, looking at the fall of the US as a global hegemon and the possible rise of China. What can the international community do to support mechanisms such as the UNSC and other bodies in maintaining international rules-based order? If you would like to answer again, of course.
I think that's a very good question and a very important question, because we are losing the moorings that have anchored the post-1945 international order. And there's too many moving parts in play at the moment. And that creates a crisis, but also, of course, it gives an opportunity for us to explore what is the world we would like, what are our diplomatic, intellectual, human capital, if you like, and economic assets for shaping the emerging structure of the world, and how do we want to prioritize those in terms of working with others. Because it remains an interdependent world. We can't just cut ourselves off. We've seen a return of hard borders We've seen the return of geopolitics. But these are eruptions of crisis points, pointing to the need to reconceptualize. Historically, of course, we have had major institutions set in train after a major hot war, world war. That is not something we can afford any longer. I think the biggest constraint to doing that is the lack of leadership, particularly the lack of any sense of international constituency in national leadership, the rise of nationalism and populist nationalism that we see, and the fraying of domestic social cohesion as well. For obvious reasons, I have particular interest in India, and the idea that you can have a government, even if it's an elected government, that simply marginalizes and occasionally demonizes 200 million of its own peoples based on religion, and that it can survive, let alone thrive. That's such a fanciful idea that even at the risk of being called all sorts of vile things by the loyal followers of that particular trend, I do speak up on these issues in India. So I think we have roles as citizens, students, scholars, whatever, to help shape an understanding, and from that, new structures and procedures that recognize our common humanity and commit us to, it's a cliche but true, to leaving a world that is better for the next generation and the generation after that than the mess that people of my generation have made of the world.
Professor.
That's a huge question to which you can only give a methodological answer. In dealing with major governance problems, and Queensland had major governance problems with its corruption in the 1980s, the answer is never a single silver bullet. In fact, of course, in international affairs, it's never any kind of bullet. The important thing is to recognise that it's a big task, and you need a lot of reforms that are mutually supportive. A bit like the integrity system is the solution to corruption in Queensland, not just an anti-corruption commission, but a series of other reforms. Similarly, when it comes to obviously reform of the international relations, you need basically ethical standard setting. That's the value setting, the norm setting. Legal regulation, that's the treaties. There are a lot of treaties that could be improved. It could be improved, and institutional design. You need all three. They're not going to be perfectly coordinated, but I think you need to have those who are committed to reform need to work on those various areas of reform simultaneously as much as possible in concert with others. But it's a huge thing, and it's not going to be one answer. It's going to be a collection of mutually supporting answers.
My question was for Professor Thakur. You mentioned as you were speaking that there were some things from the previous session that you would have disagreed with, and you sort of decided, I'll pass because you're on a different topic. But I do think some of that cross-conversation is really important in this setting so that these different topics, we begin to bring them together. So I think the point that you were on at that moment was the effectiveness of arms-based deterrence or use of nuclear deterrence, and you indicate that you disagreed with what some of the sentiments were shared by the previous panel. I'd be really interested in hearing what those points of different views are.
How much overtime can we go? Okay. Ukraine and its impact on the global non-proliferation regime and on norms of deterrence, non-use, use, etc. The comment was made, and it's been a very popular discussion all over the world. Would Russia have dared to attack Ukraine if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons? Let me start with that. Those weapons were never Ukraine's. There were Russian weapons based and hosted in Ukraine territorially. No different from American weapons in South Korea when they were there on the mainland. No different from American and other NATO weapons in 5 countries in NATO allies. That doesn't mean that Germany owns them or has them. Ukraine at the time had 1,900 strategic and 2,500 tactical nuclear weapons stored on its territory. If there'd been any move by Ukraine to say that these are ours, we are going to keep them, Russia would have much more fiercely resisted Ukraine becoming independent at the time. No major Western country would have supported it. It would have violated the NPT, and therefore Ukraine would have been an international pariah, and the entire history of the region and the world would have been completely different. So it's not even a remotely credible counterfactual, number one. 2, all this plethora of reminders of Russia's formidable nuclear arsenal, none of that succeeded as a tool of nuclear coercion or coercive diplomacy. Ukraine didn't surrender. They fought, and they have caused substantial military setbacks and degradation to Russia's forces. So you have a powerful demonstration of the lack of utility of nuclear weapons as tools of coercion and blackmail. 3rd, the existence of 6,000-odd nuclear weapons in Russia's arsenal has not prevented the United States and other NATO powers and Australia from providing highly lethal and by all accounts quite effective military assistance to Ukraine. It hasn't stopped the American intelligence from sharing targeting assistance and boasting about the fact that that was contributed to the killing of several Russian generals and to the sinking of the Black Sea Fleet's flagship Moskva. You could argue, and people have argued, that it's the nuclear weapons that have stopped the United States from declaring and enforcing no-fly zone or from intervening directly with ground troops. Take the nuclear equation out. After the history of failed interventions and losing wars over the past few decades, would the Americans really so likely commit to a land war right on Russia's borders, having failed to subdue minor powers and regional powers all over the world, bearing in mind the lessons of Napoleon and Hitler as well? So what the Russia-Ukraine comparison shows is the power of the weak when defending the homeland and the fragility of the strong when engaging in imperial adventures far away from your own home shores. It is inconceivable to me that NATO would go and consider a land war, even if you had no nuclear weapons on either side, directly against Russia. Same applies in reverse, finally. Have Russians been deterred from striking targets in Poland that are storing American supply of military armory because of the nuclear weapons? I think the far more effective constraint is the reality of their having difficulty enough subduing and swallowing eastern Ukraine, the Donbas region. Why would they be so insane as to risk a geographical extension into a NATO country, even if you had no nuclear weapons? NATO is far more formidable a military power on conventional terms compared to Russia. They wouldn't dare consider expanding it there. Now, in addition to that, we have actually had examples of nuclear-armed countries engaging in warfare recently, directly. You had India and Pakistan, after the Pulwama militant strike, when India, despite Pakistan having nuclear weapons, ordered and launched missile strikes not into disputed Kashmir territory, but deep inside uncontested, undisputed Pakistan territory. And they had a dogfight. Then you had a military clash between India and China in 2020, in which 20 Indian soldiers, and we don't know what number of Chinese soldiers were killed. But the nuclear equation wasn't factored there because both countries have this no first use policy. They believe that, their deployments and postures demonstrate that. So to me, this adds to the repertoire or inventory of lots of historical cases where it introduces an extra layer of caution, but that has to be assessed against the risks of things going wrong and the nuclear war erupting based on miscalculation, rogue launch, inadvertently, whatever. So it just doesn't hold up. I think in net terms, it contributes a lot more to the risks, and I'll finish with that. Is anyone in the world prepared to argue that the existence of 11,500 Russian and American, or nearly 12,000 Russian, American, British, and French nuclear weapons has made us feel safer with what's happening in Ukraine? Or do you actually feel more threatened that this could lead us down the path to a nuclear war that no one wants, but everyone dreads? So the balance just doesn't hold up. The old equation in my mind stays very firmly that nuclear weapons are more of a problem and a threat to our common security on this planet Earth than any benefit they might bring to calculations of national security. The reason they have never not been used since 1945, primarily in my view, is that they are not a militarily usable weapon.
We're now getting into a very difficult situation where we're looking at America fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainian. And is this going to be their normal form from now on? If the Ukrainians fight with one hand behind their back and they can't attack Russia because of the way they're being armed, then it's very easy for Russia to do what they want in that part of the world. I mean, they can sustain that forever. Just like the Americans lost the war in Vietnam because they couldn't go into North Vietnam. Why couldn't they go into North Vietnam? Probably a prolonged war against the Vietnamese. But the fact is there were 300,000 Russians in North Vietnam running all the air defence systems and running all the engineering systems and so on. So this is the other reality of this. Why would America want to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian? Well, it's just a balance of power thing. Chinese were quite happy about the impotency of the United States being displayed to the rest of the world, vis-a-vis their own interests in the territorial waters around China. Very serious problem for the United States and for all of us.
I'll keep it quick then. Charles, I just wanted to ask about the UN and Kosovo, which you had up on your slide. So NATO went in when the UN Security Council couldn't get consensus, mainly due to Russian and Chinese opposition. But NATO supported it, obviously, as did Australia, Japan, the UAE, Malaysia, Pakistan, Jordan, and many other countries around the world. Even Kofi Annan, the Secretary General, said, and I quote, "There are times when the use of force is legitimate in the pursuit of peace over this particular conflict." So can I ask you, when is it legitimate for the use of force in the pursuit of peace without UN endorsement? And what can be done to reshape the UN Security Council's membership and voting procedures to make it actually work?
The last one is a huge thing, although one of the things that I'd like to emphasise is that FDR's original idea was that there'd be 4 policemen, to which Churchill said he wanted to have a gendarme as well, because he wanted the French in with a P5. But of course the thing is that the United States Security Council has got a right to defend other countries. There's collective individual self-defence. You've got a right to do it. It's interesting. The thing is that is it a right or a duty? The policeman doesn't have. It's just a right. Oh, I can go and protect anybody I want to. They've actually got a duty to do it. One of the things I'd like to see is a gradual move, and it's not going to be quick, the idea that membership of the Security Council, both elected and permanent, is actually an office with particular responsibilities, rather than just, and something that Ramesh was talking about, is that that delegations in the United Nations act on state interests rather than actually having a specific role. Separately, of course, when it comes to FAO and the UNESCO and so forth, which tend to be, they're politicised, but they tend to be sort of more concentrating on what their values they're trying to deliver. So I think that's that particular. As far as Kosovo is concerned, gone into it in great deal of detail, going against the basic things is what do you do when you can't get if it's not collective it's not self-defence, and it's not doesn't have Security Council. If in fact somebody was being attacked, then collective self-defence means that you can assist them until the Security Council says differently. In particular case, Kosovo, if in fact the thing is that the Americans and British really thought that it was legal, they could have said, we are perfectly happy to accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ on our action. They didn't do so. One of the reasons is that, and this is quite famous, that Robin Cook, who was the Foreign Secretary, was speaking to Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, and he said, look, and she said, you're going to join us? And he said, well, I've got this little problem. All the lawyers say it's illegal. And she said, get new lawyers, which actually led to a trio of articles, get new lawyers, more and more lawyers, still no judges, and finally the answer was Goldsmith's delinquent client, talking about what they should do. Now, I think had they really thought it was legal, they would have very easy to accept the compulsory jurisdiction of that. In fact, they fought as hard as possible to ensure that because Yugoslavia was in transition, it was the former Yugoslavia, it actually meant it was difficult for them to get it going. But I think there wasn't a substantive decision that it was legal at all, and in the absence of that, I think the view of the vast number of international lawyers take note of. And by the way, so Madeleine Albright, I did work with her on a high-level panel on threats to democracy. I thought a great deal of her. But it was then very interesting, twice in my presence, she actually asked everybody there whether in fact she was a war criminal for Kosovo. So she was certainly conscious of that issue. Now, I think this is, of course, when R2P, a tremendous sort of conceptual development, is very important, and emphasises that it's not just about the idea it's do you have a right to intervention, which we talked about beforehand, and you said no, there's a responsibility to protect. It actually reverses that completely, and in a fundamentally important way. But of course, the thing is that R2P is can only be authorised by the Security Council under that 2005 high-level summit, and that it's not for interstate developments. I think I'd like to see, although very clearly R2P was not about interstate conflicts, but nonetheless, the thing is, I think ultimately I'd like to see us moving towards it, which is a bit like that question of the obligation of the 4 policemen and the one gendarme. There's one other thing that I suggested at the time, is that one approach, if you're going to engage in a controversial element, but you think you're in the right, then in that case say, we believe that this isn't the right, sue me. Basically the thing is, we accept the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. If you think it's wrong, come ahead. Because actually I thought at the time some of the extreme things, certainly things like Rwanda, I'd be amazed if the ICJ had not, if that came before the ICJ as a case, that the ICJ would not have furthered it. But then of course I repeat what Eisenhower said, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, and the law develops, and we should be prepared to subject ourselves institutionally and legally to the international law and the international legal order that we claim to support.
Can I just very quick? There's a simpler answer.
Not going to be a lot of
as well as a complex one. If the Security Council is deadlocked and stalemated, you take the issue to the General Assembly under Uniting Peace resolution. Get a majority opinion, then you can do it. They considered that, they didn't do it because they're not confident they would have the numbers.